Hi, I'm Sam Hayes. I'm author of the book Remember Henry Harris, A Story of Hope and Self-Sacrifice in America. And we have Black History Month coming up soon. It's really never too early to talk about African American history. And so I wanted to talk about today about Henry Harris and his role in Black history and really his role in Southern history and in American history. Uh, Henry Harris was uh, a basketball player, and in 1968 he became the first black uh, basketball or football player to receive a scholarship to Auburn University. He was significant because he was not only the first uh, black athlete at Auburn, he was also the first black athlete on scholarship at Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, LSU, the University of Florida. Essentially, we're talking about the seven at that time, the seven members of the SEC that were in the Deep South, and it was significant because these schools and their athletic programs had been part of the resistance to integration, sort of the backlash that occurred following the integration of so many facilities like swimming pools, restaurants, movie theaters, and the Civil Rights Act. The backlash was these universities kept their teams white as long as possible. And so it took a tremendous amount of courage for Henry Harris to step up and go to Auburn, just as it took courage for those that would follow him to the other schools. And interestingly, once Auburn signed him and kind of broke this Deep South reluctance to integrate athletics, the other six schools, SEC schools in the Deep South, all integrated within the next, most of them the following year, and then LSU and Ole Miss came along the year after that. And within 2 years, the whole league had integrated. Up to that point, only the Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky had been the only schools to integrate at that point, and they were in sort of what you would call the border South at that time. So Henry Harris what came from a background that you would not expect someone to step up and make history from. But like so many people during the civil rights movement, and this was the final stages of the civil rights movement, um, he stepped up when he had the opportunity to do something for his race, for America. Henry learned how to play basketball on a hard Alabama earth in West Alabama. You sweep it clean with a brush broom, and he had a bicycle rim nailed to a tree. That's how he learned to play basketball. Um, his father had served. Henry Harris Sr. had served in during World War II, and unfortunately, he died within 9 months of Henry's birth in 1950. And so he had a seizure, and to go to the nearest veterans hospital that would see African Americans at that time was a 4-hour trip to Tuskegee, from where Henry lived in Bologee, Alabama, and Greene County, West Alabama. And by the time he got there, he was unconscious and died 4 days later. Um, Within 9 months of his death, Henry's uncle died. He was killed. Now, Henry's uncle, Ernest Edmonds, had been a driver during World War II, received 2 battle stars. He drove officers or couriers near the front, and for that reason, he received 2 battle stars. He was killed on a Saturday night in Bolagie by a white man, and the death certificates had two boxes checked, one for accidental and the other for homicide. But it was a case that was never went to court. No charges were ever filed. And when Henry was 5 years old, his grandmother, who lived there in the community, was very close to them. Her husband was picked up one night for drunk driving and taken to jail, and the next night he died in jail of cerebral hemorrhage. Again, no charges were filed. So this is the background Henry's coming out of. Greene County was in the Black Belt. It was very, very poor. It was 84% African American at that time. It was when Henry graduated from high school in 1968. It was the sixth poorest county in America. Time, some writers would say, just kind of seemed to stand still there. The Civil Rights Movement founded in 1965. Once the Voting Rights Act was passed. Dr. King visited there several times, and as did John Lewis, Hosea Williams. SNCC was working there, the SCLC. It became a real hotbed because there was such a large black population that had been scared to do anything, had not been allowed to vote, and there was a lot of fear even when they were given that right. One of the men that became sheriff, Thomas Gilmore, told me that day was an amazing day when they finally got to vote in May of 1966. That strong men, he saw them shaking, that they were so nervous and scared about doing this. Some blacks got run off their land, as would happen if they registered to vote. Now Henry and his mother and 5 brothers and sisters, they picked cotton, and when Henry was about to enter high school, 8th or 9th grade, the landowner who they worked for and allowed them to live in a small shack there on the property, he wanted the boys, Henry and his brothers, to stay out of school for 4 or 6 weeks until all the cotton was picked. Now his mother usually let them stay out of school for a couple of weeks. They were all very good students. Henry would end up being valedictorian of his class, but this time he wanted them to stay out. And Henry's mother, Willie Mae Harris, really believed in education, and she wanted her kids to have a better life than she'd had. And she had to drop out of school when she was in the 9th grade. And so she refused and had to move from the property. They moved into some friends had a country store, concrete block, one room with a little kitchen in the back of the building that had been abandoned, had been empty, and had the store in a year or two. And these friends allowed she and her children to move into the store, and it became their home. They put up a wall. Mother and sister slept on one side. All the boys slept on the other side. And this is the house that the recruiters came to when they discovered him in 1968 in Greene County. He played for Greene County Training School. He was averaging 34 points a game. He was a 6'2" guard with really, really good one-on-one skills. He was the point guard. It's interesting that had he come along a year earlier, they would not have, neither Auburn nor Alabama would have been trying to recruit him. But now in '68, the time had come. Auburn had a couple of assistant coaches, Rudy Davalos and Larry Chapman, who thought that the school should integrate. and thought the athletic program, the basketball team, should integrate. And they found a marvelous player in Henry Harris. Chapman was one of the first. When he saw him for the first time, he says, you know, this guy was like somebody you saw in a ballet. And he said, you know, he's grasped the big story of it. He says, you know, here was this guy in a poor part of the state, and you wondered, you know, how did he get here? You know, it's like he took a wrong turn, Chapman said. So Auburn started recruiting him early, then Alabama began recruiting him. Of course, you know, although neither one of them would have recruited him a year earlier. Once Auburn started, Alabama got into it. Villanova with George Raveling, a black assistant coach, came down there and recruited him very hard. But Henry wanted to be the first. He told his high school coach that he wanted to be the first. He saw that opportunity. It was promoted by his teachers, the principal at his school, by people in the town. This was an opportunity that the community had been waiting for. Black people all over Alabama, all over the South had been waiting for it. And suddenly, here in 1968, the window to change flew open. And Henry would say later to friends at Auburn, they'd ask him, "Why'd you come here?" Well, he would say consistently, "I did it for the old folks." That you know, the people that said to him, you know, somebody's got to do this. You can do it. This is something you can do. So he went to Auburn. Now, again, this is 1968. And that's a year that everything changed, the historians say. You know, in America, we had 2 assassinations, lots of rioting in the streets against the war, against the way things were. And this restlessness you could see all over the world, in Europe and Mexico, a reluctance to accept the way things had always been. And so this is when Henry goes to Auburn. Now, the theater, swimming pools, restaurants, they had all been integrated for, you know, 3 or 4 years. And these SEC schools in the Deep South had still not integrated. That was sort of the last citadel of segregation. And in fact, it had become, sports had become a part of the resistance. Like I said earlier, part of the backlash against. They were going to hold on as long until they had to integrate. And Auburn stepped up and courageously made the first move. And should be proud that they did that, because that changed everything. Now, when Henry showed up, he really didn't know what to expect. He knew it was going to be hard, but he really had no idea how it was going to be hard. All the different facets of it that were going to be hard. He was, Henry had never gone to school with a white person. And as I said, he grew up going to Greene County Training School right across the street from the house that he lived in, or the abandoned store. And he'd gone there his whole life, only with black students. Auburn at this time had fewer than 50 black students. When he entered, I think maybe 25, 2 dozen freshmen went in, only 2 of them black freshmen. When he entered, it was a school of about 13,000 then. Only of those 25 that blacks that entered with him, 2 of them were females. So there was going to be no social life. When you go and sit down in the classroom, everybody kind of move over a little bit. That's just the way it was. That wasn't just Auburn. That was the way it was for all the first black athletes at each school. Although, the greatest resistance to integration of the student body were at these deep South schools, Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU. That was where the greatest resistance was. So what had to happen once these schools were integrated, then the band had to be integrated, and this activity had to be integrated, and athletics had to be integrated. And it took some very courageous people to step up and do that. Now, in Henry's case, his basketball life started off great. At that time, freshmen could not play varsity, so they had freshman teams. They would go and play preliminary games to the varsity. In a game at Kentucky, who's always had a loaded freshman team, Henry scored 43 points. And but it was also extremely hard. He dealt with a lot of hatred in these visiting arenas. His first game ever was at Ole Miss, and Auburn's varsity coach said that he thought Henry was scared to death over there. Henry still managed to score 25 points, but there was all kinds of threats that were coming out of the stands. Certainly this was not the majority of fans, but there was this was their opportunity in these arenas to express how they felt about the way things were going in America, how they felt about integration. They couldn't do anything about it. Laws had changed, but they could yell at this kid, 18-year-old kid out there trying to play basketball. And his teammates, it was difficult, but Henry kept playing. The following year, he moved up to the varsity. He was the best all-around player on the team, without a doubt. He was a great defensive player, great rebounder, extremely quick team player, a lot of assists, always a terrific team player. And but it wasn't a time for the black athlete to shine, as James Owens, who became the first black football player at Auburn a year later, told me. It wasn't the time for the black athlete to shine. He says, we were there just to break the fans in. So Henry was not given as much scoring opportunity as he probably would have, say, if he had gone to Villanova, perhaps. But he kept playing. He was also moved to forward, which greatly affected his running game. He was strong. He could play defense. He would guard power forwards. They thought his defense was so good. And so that's the way it kind of went on the basketball court. Away from the court, he worked hard to get along with his immediate teammates. Now, when he came to Auburn, he moved into a dormitory, an athletic dormitory, Sewell Hall, that had 150 white males in it. Most of them from Alabama or Georgia, and Southerners. Integration was new. Just blacks and whites living together was a new idea. But he got along well with his basketball teammates. This was basketball and football players, of course, in the dorm primarily. And he got along well. He worked, but he would also often disappear. And never really knew where he went. One of the players that was capped in that Henry's sophomore year, he said, he seemed like, it was great on the court, everything was great, but, around the dorm, he seemed like he was sort of scared, he just kind of hanging back, walking along the wall and all. Anyway, he'd disappear, and where he would go would be to the black side of Auburn. He'd walk. Of course, didn't have a car. And he'd walk over there. And, the first couple of years, he'd go over there in the afternoon and just sit in the black barbershop, which was, just to have, just to be around people that he didn't have to worry about what he said or what he did. That was the constant pressure that he felt on campus. So, you know, and he also went over there in the evenings, and he went to a nightclub, black nightclub, and he was um, called Vans. And the people he hung around with there were, you know, 40, 50 years old, maybe in the 30s or 20s, but a lot of people older than his mother was. And you know, but he was a hero there. You know, they would, you know, even when things weren't going well, they would boost him up. And one of his friends told me he never had to buy, you never had to buy a drink if you went over there with him because they were buying him drinks. And you know, he was the hero. He was, you know, he was the future. He was what everybody had been waiting on. Whereas the pressure he felt on what he was doing at Auburn, most people did not pick up on that. The inner pressure he felt to live up to what his race expected, what he expected to do for his race. So he was lonely. Now, in his junior year, midway through his, or late in his junior season, in a game against Alabama, which at Alabama in Tuscaloosa, he's the only black player on the court, and he gets a horrendous knee injury. It's a very rough game, a lot of technical fouls. Auburn wins the game, but it's extremely rough game, and it's a severe knee injury. But he finishes the game, and 2 nights later, Auburn plays at LSU, and he goes out there and starts that game and plays well. Finally, the pain's so great he has to come off the court in the final after only 10 minutes. There was questions of whether he'd play again that season. There were 4 more games. Well, Henry played every game, both halves. He didn't have to leave the game again. Both halves in the final 4 games. And then he'd go back to his room. They were all at home. He'd go back to his dorm room and just cry from the pain. Now, it would turn out, although they said the coach, Bill Lynn, said repeatedly that he just had torn cartilage, it turned out that Henry had not only torn cartilage, he had torn 2 knee ligaments in his left knee, the ACL and the MCL. But he still played those final 4 games. To understand that, Henry had 2 roles at Auburn, you could say. I mean, Henry was, because, you know, he was sort of a revolutionary. He was living behind enemy lines, as Tom Gossam said, who was one of the black athletes who followed him. He had two jobs. One was to hold his position, to stay there until reinforcements could arrive, until more blacks would come, and therefore the athletic program would be successfully integrated. And then the second one was to, in the meantime, during that time, was to blow up every stereotype that people had about black people. And one of the stereotypes were that blacks couldn't handle pressure, black athletes couldn't handle pressure, they'd quit on you if they got hurt. It was just all sorts of stuff that sounded like nonsense now, but was believed by many white people at that time. Well, Henry, because of his tremendous hustle, he had one of his coaches said he just had a motor that just didn't stop. Because of his tremendous hustle, he'd become a fan favorite. And this was significant because many of the individuals there that were going to these games had never cheered for a black person, never had occasion really to cheer for a black person in their life. And he was the first, and he was, blowing up their stereotypes about about black people. So he kept playing. He played on. And he had knee surgery finally after the season. And knee surgery there was fairly primitive compared to what it is now. He was in a cast for about 2 months up to his hip. And, you know, the knee did not heal properly. And he was ready to go again at, you know, in November. He was ready to go mentally again. He was ready to go back out there and play, finish his career. He'd been elected captain by his teammates unanimously, and he was their leader. And he ended up playing the whole season essentially on one leg, as one of his teammates said. And he was still better than anybody else. As the trainer said, Henry at 70% was probably better than anybody else at 100%. So when he got to the end of the season, his leg was heavily bandaged. He could hardly straighten it. It was so taped and bandaged. When he had his final home game and fouled out of his final home game, he goes to the bench. And he gets an ovation, standing ovation for a minute and a half. And this is a black American, the first black they've ever seen wear Auburn's orange and blue, wear the Auburn uniform. And it's a 90-second ovation he receives. That's how loved and respected he was by the fans. That was probably a high point. Things went downhill after that. They said he would get another surgery to further fix the knee. He never got the surgery. He was drafted in the 8th round by the Houston Rockets. Didn't make the team, of course. He said he just couldn't do the things he used to do. He said, with his normal, his knee healthy, he could play with him. He just couldn't get his body to do what it used to be able to do. Henry he comes back to school, and he's in school for a quarter and doing real well. He's decided he's going to become a coach. And he continues to encourage the other blacks that are there, whether they are the athletes or their students. He was a tremendous mentor. James Owens, the first black football player, called Henry our big brother. If Henry didn't complain, we weren't going to complain either. So, all the emotions they might be feeling, they stuffed. They had they could not, they had to stuff them to keep going because they knew black Americans, blacks in Alabama, were counting on them. They knew they had a job to do. And as hard as it might have been on them, they also knew that they had it so much better than their parents did. So, Henry's back in school. Then he gets taken off scholarship after he's back in school 1 quarter, working to get his degree. Although players were allowed to stay on until they finished, he gets taken off scholarship by the head coach, Bill Lynn, the guy he had played hurt for. And he moves. His mother's concerned about how upset he is, angry he is. Mainly angry not about being playing hurt, but angry about not being able to get a degree. Goes and lives with his brother, who's a school teacher in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And now the emotion that he's sat on is beginning to come out. He starts writing a book about his time at Auburn. And he gets a break. One of the 2 coaches that recruited him to Auburn and then had to leave, after his sophomore year, brings Rudy Davalos, gets a head coaching job at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, and has Henry come up to be an assistant coach and finish his degree. And so It's a great opportunity. Henry's excited about it. But within 5 days of Henry getting there, and this is August now, August of 1973, Davalos gets a job offer from San Antonio Spurs, and that San Antonio's where he's from, and he goes into the pros, which means, of course, bring in a new coach who is really doesn't know Henry. He's inheriting him, has no loyalty to Henry, and Henry worked hard. Coach Bill Klukas liked him, and worked hard. He coached the JV team. He helped coach the varsity guards. He recruited. He worked. He ran at the college. He ran the intramural program. He was saddled up, and also was supposed to be taking 15 hours of class work. People liked him. He was real popular with the football coaches, the basketball assistant. But about in January, they tell him they're not going to renew his position again. And there was no loyalty by the athletic director or the coach to him. So they don't renew his position. So once again, he's without an opportunity to get his degree. And his mother expects him to get a degree, and he wants a degree. He finishes the season on out and tries to work something out. He thinks he's going to get drafted maybe by the ABA, which the Spurs were in. The American Basketball Association has a draft. He thinks he's going to possibly get drafted. They've drafted people even out of college, or maybe get a job in Europe, a basketball playing position in Europe, which he was clearly qualified to do, and probably to play in the ABA at least as a reserve, even with his knee injury. He continued to work out and try to rehabilitate his knee. And but then he doesn't get drafted in mid-April when that draft's held. He doesn't, he's at the end of his rope. Right, as far as he can't figure, the school is blocked, his basketball career is blocked, and there was also pressure on him to live up to. Among the pressure he carried at Auburn was to be as good a player. One, he wanted to go into the pros to help his family financially. They were poor country people, and he could make he was the one given the opportunity to go and make some decent money, and wasn't successful in that. But he's also expected, and these early black athletes put this on themselves, that they had to prove, not only they had to defy stereotypes, felt like they had to prove that black athletes were good. They had to be good players. And although he was a good player, he did not attain the star status that was thought of him. And so there was a feeling of failure there, that you've let your race down. And so his depression is increasing. He's smoking more marijuana, which was extremely common on college campuses in the late 60s and early 70s. It was certainly smoked a lot at Auburn by athletes and others. And the depression just finally overtakes him. So one night during this week that, there was no draft, he's gone back to the AD to try to figure out a way to stay in school. He's still up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and he is living on the 17th floor of a high-rise dorm at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and he jumps out the window. Just an incredible tragedy. Nobody knows this has happened until about 11 o'clock the next day, when his body is discovered. And, the shock in Alabama and back in Greene County was just huge. Nobody believed that he could have done this. And but you know, all the emotion that he felt just finally overtook him. And the assistant coach, Tom Sager, said there that he just had held so much in, it just sort of finally exploded. And since that time, unfortunately, Henry Harris has disappeared from memory. It seems like suicide lands people in history's penalty box because, you know, as popular as he was at Auburn, you know, most people don't even know who he is. And that happened very quickly. The blacks that came after him had no idea who he was. They didn't talk about it. It was obviously an embarrassment what had happened. But, you know, the cost of that, so that's understandable. But the cost is that Henry's been forgotten, and his contribution. It was a young guy that had a chance to do something. I mean, how many kids graduated from high school in 1968 in America? And here was the guy that could do something right then with his life. Of course, people that were not going to college, the males that were not going to college, were getting sent off to Vietnam. Henry was going to deal with what needed to be changed here in America. He stepped up. He is and it seems like what's happened historically is that the focus is this one night, this one very long night after 3 a.m. when not many good decisions are ever made. This decision he makes at that moment seems to be more important than all that he did before that, where the focus is on this one night rather than these nearly 1,000 nights he stayed at Auburn, when, you know, most people would have left. Common sense might have told you to leave. There are plenty of good players that chose not to be the first, or even the first two, or first three, or first half dozen at these Deep South major universities, because they knew how difficult it was going to be. But Henry said he wanted to be the first. He wanted to use his life. He was inspired by what he saw in Greene County, how that community, the black community, had united and finally gotten rights, the right to vote, the right to go into a store using the front door. You know, I said Dr. King came there. Dr. King spoke in Greene County 2 weeks before he died in Memphis, was murdered in Memphis. And so he was there walking he inspired that whole generation of people, and Henry Harris was one of the people that he inspired. He did change things within by the time the year he killed himself in 1974, a black Auburn freshman led the SEC in scoring. Another black Auburn freshman led the SEC in rebounding. That's how quickly things changed. And then it sped up again in the 1980s, and we know what kind of success the SEC has had, and where would they be without the black athlete today? But somebody had to get it started. Henry Harris and a bunch of guys that came after him got it started. He was not the first black player in the SEC. That was Perry Wallace, first black basketball player. Nate Northington and Greg Page were the first at the University of Kentucky, were the first black players in the SEC, football players, to sign a scholarship. Perry Wallace was at Vanderbilt. But Henry Harris integrated the Deep South. He needs to be remembered. It's You know, it's not only black history what he did, it's Southern history and it's American history.